Does the common American, Joe, John Doe, and Susie Q, do they know more about the economy than the holders of the fanciest degrees in economics? Surely not. And yet, there's a survey from NBC that seems to show that for years, that has been the case. We're going to talk about it with Jeff Snider, the head of global research at Alhambra Partners. My name's Emil Kalinowski. Jeff, we're going to be referencing a post you did at Alhambra Investments on the 24th of August. The title is, "They've Lost That Loving Feeling." And we're going to go to an NBC News Survey public poll. Is there anything do you want to introduce this poll before we dive in? How did you find it?
It's just it's a poll like any other poll. Just happened to be it has a pretty long history dating back quite a while, almost 20 years. So that's really kind of our interest here, because we want to have sort of a consistent sampling process and the same type of data that goes back as well. So there's not any discontinuities in the figures, so we can be reasonably assured that what we're looking at is consistent across time. So that's the reason why we decided to highlight this NBC News poll, is because it goes back that long. And yes, these polls tend to be political in nature, because that's really what NBC News is looking at, is analyzing some kind of election or something about that. But this one question that they've been consistently asking is a very simple one. It has nothing to do with politics. Yeah, the responses might be political that people give, but really it's just, hey, what do you feel the economy is doing right now? And they've been asking this question for that length of time, and so there's really some value in this type of consistency and even this type of poll.
Well, I've pulled up a graph now. You've labeled three little sections here: euro dollar number 2, euro dollar number 3, euro dollar number 4. But Jeff, let's take a look at euro dollar number 1, more popularly known as the global financial crisis. And let me zoom down here. Maybe you did do it, and I was looking at the wrong page. There it is. So this is the key. So the green square dashed line, that represents the number of people saying the economy is poor, right? And then we've got the unemployment rate, the rate that Mrs. Yellen was looking to, and all the economists are looking to determine whether or not the economy is doing well. And look at what happens in 2005 and 6, right? It goes the wrong way.
You would think it would be the other way around, right? The unemployment rate would rise, and then consumer confidence, or the proportion saying that the economy is doing poor, would follow. But yet, what we see is that consumers started to get their concerns before they got their pink slips from being laid off, and it's really kind of again, consistency in the poll, but you see something like that, it seems like maybe there's some value, some unappreciated value beyond simply the consistency in the polling.
Jeff, there's a little bit of a difference with the euro dollar number 2, 3, and 4. There seem to have been more surveys. I noticed that there's only like one data point there, one square. Did they just kind of forget to ask during that period that question or something? Did they skip for a couple of years?
I think that's really what it was, that it wasn't asked regularly at that point, at that stage, whereas in the post-crisis era, obviously with the economy being the number one topic on everybody's mind, they made more of an effort to consistently ask the question.
Got it.
Which, again, that kind of makes sense, because before 2008, in the 21st century, after the dot-com recession, people started thinking about the economy, but really, go back to the 90s and the 80s, the economy was one of the last things people, especially pollsters, were actually thinking heavily about, and were actually thinking that the American public was thinking much about, because it had always seemed to be very robust, the quote-unquote great moderation and all of that. And then suddenly, 2008 comes along, and now the economy has been consistently on the top of everybody's mind, which is kind of what we're going for here. And really, in this particular poll, it started to become on the American public's mind before we ever got to the big recession in 2008.
Exactly. But some people, economists, let's call them, will say, that may have been a statistical anomaly. Yeah, the proportion went up, but we didn't ask that question often enough, so maybe it was just an anomaly. But now we move forward a few years to 2011, the nail in the coffin of the Eurodollar system. And what do we see? We see 3 consecutive surveys suggesting, no, it is going the wrong way. And I draw that number to everyone's attention. 1, 2, 3 in a row saying, we're going the wrong way. Does the timing line up, Jeff, with what was happening in the global monetary system in Europe, mind you? Jeff, it was in Europe where the locus of this crisis took place. And yet the average lazy American, quote unquote, knew what was happening.
Absolutely. And it does line up perfectly with Eurodollar number 2. So we're looking at 2011 and into 2012, which was, well, the U.S. didn't actually register a recession, which is why the poll numbers probably didn't go even further than they had. But the Europeans did, and growth slowed across the rest of the world. But it was definitely an interruption, a serious interruption in the quote-unquote recovery of the global economy, because it wasn't a recovery. And that was something that was picked up, not just in markets like bonds and bond yields falling, but by, again, these lazy American workers who could sense, at least some of them could sense, that things were not going in the right direction, even though the unemployment rate, some of the labor market data was suggesting that maybe things were still fine. There's really nothing to be worried about.
Let me read a quote from yesteryear, Jeff, because this is a survey done by NBC. Let's go to October 17th, 1965. NBC's Meet the Press. William F. Buckley Jr. Here's what he says. As Franklin Adams once said, I think the average American is a little bit above average. And under the circumstances, I rejoice over the influence of the people over their elected leaders, since by and large, they show more wisdom than their leaders or their intellectuals. I'm often quoted as saying, I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston telephone directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University. I love it. I love it. Now let's move forward.
Well, there's simplicity to it because, economists have lots of data. They have their theories. They're weighed down by their ideology. And so they have all that baggage. As we just spent the last segment talking about, they have these fixed ideas that need to be, that if there's contrary data to their fixed ideas, they can't just easily say, well, my whole worldview has just been falsified. I'm going to throw everything out the window. Whereas the American worker doesn't have that baggage. The American worker can just say, yeah, I see the unemployment rates falling. And everybody tells me the economy is moving. But that's certainly not what I see in my own experience. And I don't care about whether or not econometric models are perfect or even good. I don't care about, that our theories on the Phillips curve and inflation are, too, maybe not complicated or not too complicated. I just know that everybody says the economy is moving in the right direction, but I just don't see it. My world doesn't line up with all of those things. And by the way, there's a few more of my neighbors who are starting to agree with my assessment too.
Yeah, let's take a Phillips screwdriver through that Phillips curve model. That's what the average American is saying. And Jeff, again, I say 3 consecutive readings, because sometimes they'll be asked, and there's it does go the wrong way. Hey, I don't like the economy. But not for 3 in a row. Look when the next time, when that green square dash line goes up, Eurodollar 3. Jeff, does the timing of the next surge in pessimism, I guess surge, I'm overdoing it, but the clear break from a trend towards optimism, towards improvement, does it line up with the third Eurodollar crisis, which, Jeff, was thousands of miles away from the shores of America in China and Brazil?
Yeah, it's 2015, that weird year where everybody was convinced after 2014's best job market in decades, the unemployment rate tumbling far and fast, and Janet Yellen just itching to get on with not just terminating QEs but also hiking rates. That was supposed to happen as early as May and June of 2015, and instead they started talking about an oil crash and overseas turmoil, as you just pointed out, and all these other things, and then they only managed poor Janet Yellen only managed the one rate hike in December 2015 and then took a whole year off of any other ones. So not only does the survey of the American workers essentially, but American people, American voters, not only does the survey pick up this economic weakness, but eventually the economists agreed with it. After the fact, they said, maybe there is some economic weakness here. Again, it wasn't a recession in the United States, but it was that near recession in the U.S. was a part of a global whole, which was in some places far, 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 far worse. So again, the survey of American people picked up on what was already evident and predicted in bond yields, which was falling yields throughout 2014 that accelerated 2015 and especially late 2015 and 2016, which was the bond market saying, we predict that there's going to be a slowdown. The American people saying, yeah, we start to feel the slowdown. And then only after it's over do the economists come back and say, oh, there might have been a slowdown. That's really kind of the repeating pattern here.
And Jeff, it wasn't an economic shock in the United States, but a socioeconomic political shock, because you remember that's when Bernie Sanders, avowed socialist, and the Orange Man came to the fore, totally out of character for what we've seen for decades. But
and unpredicted, right? And that was, this was supposed to be out in 2016, Brexit, all of these things that kept happening in the political sphere as a consequence of economy and economic conditions that don't line up to the mainstream narrative. Now, it does line up to the actual underlying baseline condition, which is set by the bond market, which tells you that, hey, there's things that are going wrong, not right, more going wrong than going right. And so when the American people start to tell pollsters that they sort of agree with that at the margins, there's a few more Americans that agree that things are going poorly than better, despite the fact that the unemployment rate continues to fall and the establishment survey continues to look good, you really need to pay attention to that and think, what is going on right now that these things are starting, apparently the apparent contradictions, maybe they're not really contradictions at all.
Let's move forward in time again, Jeff. I'm counting 1, 2, 3 increases in the negativity in let's say, call it 2019. Going counter trend to the unemployment rate. Are Americans
50-year low in the unemployment rate too? Remember that was the big deal about 2018, 2019 was that wasn't just the unemployment rate was low, it was a 50-year. It was the boom of all booming economies.
Jeff, are these lazy, unemployed, uneducated Americans, are they actually secretly epidemiologists? Did they know that the corona was on its way? Were they clued in with what was happening in China? Or no, is it just what we've been talking about, Jeff?
They were predicting coronavirus. No, and I think that's part of the problem that we're just about to get into, is that lost in all of this COVID and coronavirus in 2020 is the fact that the global economy started its downturn at the start of 2018. And that in many places around the world, Japan, Germany, and places like countries like that, they had already entered recession before anybody knew about COVID or the corona or Wuhan or anything of the sort. And yes, Americans in that same NBC survey had started to pick up on that same weakness that had already worked its way in. We talk about all the time the landmine in late 2018. That's really what Americans in this poll were responding to, the fact that the globally synchronized downturn was becoming more and more synchronized as 2018 ended and 2019 began, which again was the exact opposite interpretation of most people at the time, especially those at the central bank. Remember, Jay Powell was still hiking rates because he thought things were going to be inflationary and even more inflationary better in 2019.
The Economist had that fantastic hot rod cover of Jay Powell and an orangey shimmer and driving across the desert and the thunder and the lightning, and they had this, what was the title? America's
Running
Extraordinary
Hot. Yeah,
Gamble.
Extraordinary Gamble, Running Hot.
Woo!
And at the time, here we have the bond market saying, hey, maybe there's stuff going on.
I think it was April, right? The dollar hit its low, maybe the weekend they published it.
February, I think it was the February 2008 version, which is right when things were starting to change. Yes. They basically, top ticked it and rang the bell for reflation number 3. But again, the idea is that the Economist never really changed its tune. Even into 2019, they were confused, as most economists were. Why is Jay Powell starting to cut rates? It doesn't really seem like he should. when in fact the American people were like, we're moving in the wrong direction here. It's not like 2020 where there was a legitimate recession, or full-blown recession, I should say, but the economy was not moving in the way the unemployment rate seemed to make it seem, which is that this tremendous, awesome, booming period when it was actually a period of weakness that was getting weaker by the month. And this is before we ever got to Corona and China and everything else.
Now, I think we're going to go over what the latest poll results are. But before we do, I want to tell the audience that people are probably thinking, this can't be right. How is it that just average Joes and Janes can be out thinking the highly educated? And it's really, it's a perspective and a lack of independence by those that are in the establishment. And I'm going to read a few lines from a book called The Wisdom of Crowds, and it was by James Surowiecki. And here, let me just read it. The premise of The Wisdom of Crowds is that under the right conditions, group can be remarkably intelligent, and that they can actually be smarter than even the smartest within them. And then he gives the example of a jar of jelly beans and asking all of us to guess how many there are. And that even if there are jelly bean experts in the room, our average is going to be better on average in like 95% of the estimates. The most famous example, of course, comes from 1906, 1907, depending on which internet source you use. Francis Galton. He collated the answers of 787 farmers, butchers, livestock experts, housewives from a competition asking the public to guess the weight of an ox. Remarkably, the average of all the guesses, 1,198 pounds, Jeff, you had that one, was only off by Galton's, it was only off by 0.1%, Jeff. And then in the book, they give lots of other examples, like Who Wants to Be a Billionaire, asking the crowd versus phoning a friend. The U.S. Navy finding the USS Scorpion in 1968. They had no idea where it was. It sank, and they did kind of a wisdom of the crowd Bayesian kind of study modeling, and they found it. The shuttle exploded in 1986, the Challenger, and how Morton Tycall's stock went down much more than the other companies that were involved with the space shuttle. But here's the key. Researchers attempting to leverage the wisdom of the crowds to answer seemingly impossible questions must do so with care. The assessments must be diverse and independent of one another. Estimates should be decentralized, drawing on private local knowledge. Non-independent guesses that rely on others' approximations can be self-reinforcing and send the process erroneously off path. Do you see where I'm getting at, Jeff? Is that the economists, they all think the same, right? It's not independent thought.
Not just that. Look, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to plot that NBC poll result against the unemployment rate. And you can see, by and large, the two match, especially since in the post-crisis era. And I think that's why it was exactly what we're talking about here, is that there's this self-reinforcing non-independence upon being picked up in the poll results. In other words, people's perceptions of the economy are colored by the unemployment rate, right? They don't know what the economy's doing because the economy is this big, ephemeral thing. It's not a tangible thing you can just look at and say, this is what it is. And so the poll results, by that overall trend down and to the right, is being influenced by the unemployment rate, because people don't follow the economy. They don't follow these economic numbers, but they probably do hear about the unemployment rate fairly regularly. And so that's why overall perception is skewed by the unemployment rate, except for these specific periods. And so that's really what we're doing. Exactly what the quote you just read is exactly what we're doing. We're saying, look, even in this big data way, we have this self-reinforcing sort of spoilage in the data. But when it doesn't spoil, when we finally see these intermittent periods where the unemployment rate no longer holds its power and sway, that's when we pay attention, because that's where the public is saying, well, the unemployment rates is going lower, but we're not kind of feeling it this time like we do normally. And that's really what we're looking at here, that the American public is very much affected, and its opinion on the economy is very much affected by the unemployment rate, except during these certain periods. And that's really when we got to pay attention to them.
Earlier in episode 1, I revealed that the U.S. unemployment rate dropped to 5.2% for August 2021, the lowest level since March 2020. Jeff, does the NBC survey of average regular Joe Americans and Susie Q's correlate, or has it broken free again, going the wrong direction, away from the unemployment rate?
Not only has it gone the wrong way, it's gone the wrong way by quite a lot, actually. In fact, according to the poll results, which were taken during August, during the same month where the unemployment rate fell a couple tenths more to 5.2%, the amount of people saying that the economy is doing poorly surged upwards. I think it was 34% of the entire sample, which was the highest since last summer, which, you know, we're not supposed to think the economy is doing as bad this summer as it was last summer, are we? Are we really leading to that conclusion? But, you know, the other thing is that it's been, and I know you're going to pick up on this, Emil. I'm going to spoil.
No, maybe not. I don't know. Go ahead. Tell me. What? I don't know.
Again, look at where the poll turned. Now,
Okay.
I know there wasn't consistent polls throughout the year, but the valley in the amount of, in the proportion of the public saying the economy is doing poorly was in April. Again, March and April. Ever since March and April, we consistently see in all of these data where things seem to be going in the wrong direction again, a rolling over of the global economy, including the U.S. economy, despite Uncle Sam's best efforts, or at least Uncle Sam's gargantuan efforts.
Yeah.
That, you know, the public is picking up on something, the employment data is picking up on something, the bond market predicted all of this as usual. And it's not just COVID, it's not just renewed corona, it's not just, you know, what is the other excuses, labor shortage.
Where's Donald Trump?
These numbers here don't really
What's
look like
doing?
a labor shortage.
Can we blame him? Is
we blame who?
the orange Donald Trump, the orange man, is he doing anything right now? Is he initiating
And
a
that's
trade war?
that's where it really becomes so unhelpful, is that this becomes a partisan football. So Democrats are going to blame Donald Trump for not doing enough, for not doing the right things. Republicans are going to blame Joe Biden for not doing enough, not doing the right things. And everybody's out to lunch on what's really going on here, which is neither party has done the right things for a very, very long time. And each one is captured by economics to continue to do the wrong things over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, in an earlier episode, we talked about how there have been 4 presidents since this silent depression began, 2 of each party, you know, and the nostrum and the palliatives and the tonics that they apply, none of them work. So it's not a partisan thing. Jeff, that's it for me.
Why don't they work? You know, that's the next part. Why don't they work? Why is what they do never seem to be effective? Why do we continue to go down the road of the Japanese path when we have the Japanese example right in front of us as something not to do? That's really the issue. It's not really about 2020 and coronavirus. Yes, that was the shock, and that is certainly causing complications in the recovery since then. But this is a pattern we keep seeing repeated over and over again. As your analogy before, you know, the economy gets knocked down. We pick the person back up, and they just fall right back down again. Why? That's what we need to zero in on.
Well, Japan leading the way and showing us what not to do is going to come up in part 3. We're going to take a lightning round through the Commonwealth, touch on a few of Jeff's articles, a few news stories, and wrap up the show.